All right, everybody, we'll kick things off now. We are going to kick off this week's WTF Wednesday, which we have Kyle Serra, who is going to be speaking to us about Microsoft 365. And we're going to be more focused on Entra ID today. So, very excited about that. And as we know, Entra ID is extremely powerful, there's a lot to it. I think often, just like any tools that we have, we're scratching the surface level at it. So the more we can delve deeper into it to allow us to better better support our clients and make our lives easier as well, more the better. So. With that being said, Kyle, I'm going to turn things over to you. I want to welcome you, and if you want to give a brief introduction for those that aren't familiar with you, that would be great as well.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. Happy to be here, and thanks everyone for your time today. Yeah, my name is Kyle Sura. I've been a consultant for going on about 7 or so years now. I have a background in IT and help desk. Have almost a dozen Microsoft certs underneath my belt. I'm a contributor to the CIS M365 benchmark, which we'll talk about today. There's a lot of good information there for you guys for securing your environments, including Entra ID. And last week we talked about conditional access. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. So let me get this screen share going. Can you guys see the full screen version of this slide?
Not yet.
And do
Oh,
the
there it goes. Just
oh,
came in.
okay. One sec. Let me do this another way. Let me just share this whole screen. Okay, how's it look now?
Still waiting. Oh, there it
Great.
goes.
Cool. All right. So sorry about that, everybody. Um, so just in terms of today's presentation, um, about me, I kind of just went over that a little bit. I will be talking about a brief overview of 365 and Entra, some recommended security controls to focus on, some general security best practices for MSPs, and some key takeaways, and last but not least, a Q&A. I just kind of talked about this a little bit. Have been a Microsoft certified cybersecurity architect expert, spending a lot of time in 365 and Azure. Got a bunch of these certs while getting my bachelor's through Western Governors University, and one of 17 contributors to CIS 365 benchmark. So been doing this for a while, a lot of security assessments, risk assessments, remediation, incident response, and all that good stuff. In terms of a 365 overview, by the way, if you were here for last week's session, these first two slides are basically going to be a slight repeat. So if you need a cup of coffee, now would be the time. But 365 is a managed evergreen SaaS environment. Basically, it demands your continuous investment. Security is going to have to be revisited on a regular basis. Its capabilities are growing and changing. Much like a child, its capabilities are going to change over time. How much food they need changes over time. So a cloud environment like 365 is much the same. Because this is a software as a service environment, Microsoft's shared responsibility model states that as the cloud customer, we're responsibility for data classification and accountability, and partially responsible for client endpoint protection, with Microsoft also being involved in that. And then we're partially responsible for identity and access management, as well as Microsoft partially being responsible for that. And then they handle the rest of the areas below: application level controls, network controls, host infrastructure, and physical security. 365 sits on top of an Entra ID tenant, which we'll be talking about today. Entra ID is the default identity provider for 365 and Azure, and it's how you log into those platforms and your cloud applications. In terms of an Entra ID overview, it's hosting as an identity provider. It's hosting your users, your groups, your sign-in and audit logs. It's what's making authentication possible. Your authorization and your accounting, your core AAA capabilities. Why it matters for security. Attackers are actively compromising user accounts via phishing to gain access to M365 and Azure through Entra ID. So, it's not that easy to break encryption, but it is easy to convince somebody to give you their credentials. So that's what they like to try to do. So compromising user account is now the primary attack method for attackers. So things like credential theft, token theft, MFA abuse, OAuth abuse, it all goes through Entra ID. MFA fatigue attacks have largely been mitigated by Microsoft in the recent years through number matching, where before, some of you guys might remember, you would just get that approve or deny, and the attacker could just keep on spamming that notification until someone finally just hits approve and let them in. That's not something we have to deal with so much these days, which is great. Compromising a global admin, impacts EntraID 365 and Azure. That's a very bad situation you want to try to avoid. And again, last week's session on conditional access kind of got into more of the nitty gritty of how to configure policies, how to roll out MFA. So I encourage you to check that out if you haven't had a chance yet. In terms of privilege governance, some of the things we'll talk about today is privilege identity management, access reviews, some least privilege enforcement. And in terms of a security takeaway, one big thing that's often overlooked is you want to protect Entra Connect for hybrid organizations. So for folks who have been on-prem and they want to get into 365, they're going to install Entra Connect on a server. What that contains in a SQL database is what is considered the multiverse. So when you do a sync from on-prem to the cloud, you are doing an import of the data. You're doing a synchronization of that data. It could be a full sync, a delta sync, and then you're exporting the changes from on-prem to the cloud and making those changes. If somebody, an attacker, were to get onto that machine and modify that multiverse, there's different rules in there. Like you could say, if an account syncs up, make them a global admin, for example. So there's different things you can do that are pretty nefarious. So you really want to protect whatever machine that has Entra Connect on it, through a lot of just basic security controls you guys are all familiar with. You want antivirus, you want, patch management on there, you want least privilege access, you want to protect with MFA if possible, a lot of those best practice sorts of things. You also want to consider using a standard such as the CIS, Center for Internet Security's Microsoft 365 Foundation's benchmark. That's a standard that's changing twice a year in response to the ever-changing threat landscape and Microsoft's changing of features in 365. So while we all roll out best practices as part of what we do, being aligned to a standard specifically is where you want to be. Because anyone can say like, oh yeah, we're using best practices, but there's no substance in that description. To say like, yes, we're aligned to this standard at this version, at this level is a level of maturity. You want your customers to be, you want to be in internally as well. Cyber insurers love to see it, regulators love to see it. So that's something that's worth striving for. By default, security defaults are enabled and they're kind of insufficient for real world threats. You want that granular protection conditional access provides for things like making sure not every user and device on the planet can connect to your environment is a really good thing. And that's something that you can start to, roll out through conditional access. In a properly designed conditional access and hardening, EntraID offers critical security protections for the modern organization. So again, with security defaults, at least out of the box, MFA is basically always on or always off. It's not very granular. You want to control certain aspects of it, like if they want to access sensitive information, maybe they got to come from a compliant device. If they're a global admin, maybe they got to use phishing resistant MFA like a YubiKey. Those sorts of things. In terms of 10 recommended CIS M365 benchmark V6 controls. I'll just go over these at a high level, but I do recommend everyone considers implementing these for not only internally, but for your customers as well. You can grab a copy of this benchmark from CIS. It's available for your internal use, but if you want to commercialize it, you do need a separate license for them. But that aside, the first two controls are newer ones that came out in this version, our latest version, again, version 6, which came out in the fall. So when you join a device to Entra, you want to try to limit the device being having local administrator rights for the user that joins it. That's something that historically has been by default. You can now change that. Having users be local administrators on their devices is just not a place you want to be security-wise. God forbid if they were to click on some sort of malicious link and get malware installed, it's going to love having unrestricted access to do that. Even if you have, anti-malware protections, having admin rights for all of your users is just not where you want to be. In that vein, Control 5145 ensure local administrator password solution or LAPS is enabled is another important one. We're all used to having a kind of a local admin on each device when we roll it out, probably through a golden image historically or some other method. Problem is that that password's not changing by default. So if somebody were to compromise that password, whether it's someone internally, maybe a malicious or disgruntled employee, or even an attacker, if they catch wind of it, now they have the ability to move laterally across all devices because now they know what that password is and all the devices have it. So LAPS changes that and makes it so that that password is rotating on a consistent basis to help protect you against lateral movement. Control 5151, ensure user consent to apps accessing company data on their behalf is not allowed, is basically out of the box, especially for older tenants that have been kicking around for a while. Microsoft lets users bring in enterprise apps to the environment without admin acknowledgement or approval. So users could sign up for almost any enterprise app that's out there. And what that looks like is when the user wants to bring it into the environment, they have to sign in with their credentials, and now that application has access to their profile, their data, which ultimately is company data, which could run foul of regulatory requirements. It's a shadow IT problem. Who knows where that data is being stored? Who knows of how trustworthy the enterprise app is? So one of the ways you want to control that is restricting it and allowing the use of the admin consent workflow, where basically a user says they want access to an enterprise app, and then they would have to get approval to get that. So that's a loophole I would recommend changing. I've seen this used in an attack I responded to with a customer. The attacker got into an account through phishing. Then they brought in an enterprise app for a mail blasting application, and then used that mail blasting app to send out their phishing email to their address book, their own list of customers. So that was a real life usage of that loophole by an attacker. So it is being used out in the wild. I've seen it myself. So I strongly consider that to be a high priority. Controls 5232 and 5233 are about implementing the custom band password lists in Entra and extending them to on-premises if applicable. If you are, let's say you are in Florida, and you might want to ban the words Miami or Dolphins, for example. We know our users like to put words in their passwords that they're familiar with. Things like summer, fall, spring, winter, things like current presidential candidates, things like that. You kind of see those on password lists that get released, that are commonly broken into by attackers. You want to try to ban those phrases, and especially ones that are more specific to your organization, I would say as well. Microsoft does have an opaque global ban password list that they maintain, but if there's something really unique to you, like a company name, a street name for the headquarters, things like that, definitely more focused on that side of things. But if you want to be certain that some of those more generic terms are blocked, you would throw that on that custom ban password list. And also, if you extend it on-prem, you can do that in an audit mode where you can kind of see who would be impacted before you actually enforce it. So it's a pretty seamless rollout. Can happen pretty quick. These last four controls, 5, 3, 1, 2, 3, and 4, are about principal least privilege. So privilege identity management is just-in-time access. It's Microsoft basically saying, if you're an admin, if you have one of the admin roles in the environment, you do not need to be an admin 24/7. You just need to merely be eligible to be an admin for the time in which you have to use those controls. So historically speaking, if you were to grant someone a global admin, they are permanently active with that role. So if that account gets compromised, that account has global admin rights right off the rip. That's just how it works. But with just-in-time access, you can basically say, all right, well, for 7 hours of today's work, I didn't have to log in as a global admin at all, even though I'm able to. So I'm only going to log in for an hour, activate my global admin rights for an hour, and then after that hour, they're going to be removed from my account. So you basically use them just as just in time, just as needed. And then if your account gets breached, there's an extra step to go ahead and activate that role or get it approved, which is I'll skip down to 534, which is basically saying if you have folks who are global admins, if possible, try to have an approver in there. So like maybe their manager has to approve, they get an email, there's a ticket involved. That way they can't just unilaterally enable that kind of super admin privilege. But that might not be reasonable or appropriate for every organization, but merely consideration. 532 and 533 are for access reviews. So this is an automated way of something you all could be or should be doing at least manually. So at least once a month, you want to review who your guests are, who your admins are, make sure you're aware of that list. You don't want people sneaking on that list through group membership or, folks internally, escalating their own privileges if they have the ability to. You want to be able to consistently say you have eyes on who have these rights and these accounts and then approve or deny that. Microsoft has some logic in there where you can have some automation involved where it can say like, hey, this person hasn't signed in for 30 days. We would recommend that you disable or remove these privileges, and you can either take those recommendations or not. But that's a nice automated way Microsoft offers. These last four controls are all dealing with Entra ID Premium 2 licensing, of which you would need at least one license, but Microsoft's best practices for licensing is any user who's using the feature should have a license in the environment that's paid for, even if it's not directly assigned. So some general and security best practices for MSPs. This is my last substantial slide, so I'll try to get through this pretty quick. Again, if you haven't done one, I would consider a 365 security assessment and then hardening whatever gaps you find through remediation at least once a year, because again, these best practices are changing twice a year. Standardizing again on a benchmark is a best practice, and I believe the CIS 365 foundational benchmark is the gold standard. By default, Microsoft doesn't enable the unified audit log, so I recommend that you review your tenant and all your customers' tenants just to make sure that is enabled. Logs are kept for 180 days, but I would consider trying to keep those logs for at least a year. There are certain attackers who like to kick around in your environment for a while, so they might be there for a few months waiting to kind of insert a fake invoice, and you don't want the original logs of when they first got in to be erased, and you have no idea how long they've actually been there. So that would be helpful. We talked about the enterprise apps earlier. Trying to lock that down. You also want to review those apps lists. So if you haven't, if that was news to you and you haven't done a review before, go through your enterprise apps list and make sure that you're okay with whatever's been brought in. You can consider removing access to it as well if you're not. I always like to mention the importance of break glass accounts. You don't want to get locked out of your environment, especially if you're doing conditional access work. So try to have at least two accounts, at least one excluded from every single conditional access account, and have phishing resistant MFA configured on those accounts. Try to restrict your conditional access modifications to using protected actions. So basically, you don't want any global admin or anyone able to modify your conditional access policies, including attackers potentially. You want to restrict that to the conditional access administrator or security administrator role if possible. And then last but not least, Microsoft recently released automated risk remediation for user risk, which impacts both password-based users and passwordless users. So that relies on the automatic revoking of passwords and active sessions, or revoking the user sessions if they were, and having them automatically have to re-authenticate. So that's something to look at. I believe it's still in preview, but worth checking out. And again, I believe that's a premium, at least a premium one feature to get conditional access, and for the automatic risk, that's premium too. And the key takeaways: protect EntraID Connect. We talked about that earlier. If that box is compromised, there's a good chance your 365 is also compromised. Security assessments, standardization, considering using just-in-time access or PIM, access reviews, custom man passwords lists, restricting that app consent, and last but not least, enable logging and configure your break glass accounts are the major takeaways from today's presentation. I know that was a lot. Any questions?
All right, awesome stuff. Let me bring it back here.
Can you go back a slide, please?
Oh, wrong way.
The access. Can you go one more? Sorry. unified audit log. That's it. Thank you.
You're welcome. So yeah, if you go to the security center and you click on audit, if it's not enabled, typically you'll see like a blue banner across the top that says, "Hey, start logging." Um, if you see that, chances are it's not enabled. You could also verify in PowerShell, which I recommend. You can both enable it through PowerShell and also verify it through PowerShell. So that's again something you want to make sure you have in place, because if somebody were to break in, you want to be able to see what they're doing and what they clicked on.
When you
All right.
said you needed premium for that, you were talking business premium, or there's another premium thing you need to add.
Entra ID Premium 1 and Premium 2 licensing are separate from Business Premium. Business Premium does include Premium 1, but the P is just stands for Premium, so that's why it's a little confusing. For conditional access, you need that Premium 1 license, and if you want the automatic user risk remediation and risk calculation embedded in your conditional access policies, and you want access to the privilege identity management, access reviews, that's where the Premium 2 licensing will come in through Entra ID.
Okay. So for, I assume as a consultant, you're familiar with Huntress
Mhm.
and what it does. Is Microsoft just now getting to the point where they can do what Huntress has done, where if they see an impossible sign in, like somebody that only signs in Saratoga, all of a sudden they see a sign in Minnesota and they're like, okay, that's impossible travel. Boom, lock the account out. Is that
So I wouldn't put it as just getting around to it. The risk factoring has been in place for a while, the Entra ID governance and protection features. So, basically with a Premium 2 license in your tenant, Microsoft is analyzing your sign-in activity, and it's looking for things like impossible travel, atypical travel, anonymous token usage, unknown device, all that good stuff. That's been in place for a while now. And then based off of, what those signals are and how they rate, your risk scoring may increase from low to medium to high. And then based off of that overall user or sign-in risk rating, and historically you've been able to integrate that with conditional access and say like, hey, if this user sign in or the sign in activity or this user risk is high risk, maybe block the sign in activity. That's what you've been able to do. But now with the conditional access risk, automated risk remediation, you can say rather than, just, blocking it or forcing a password reset, it's going to go a step further and try to do some more automation to try to take care of that for you and do some additional remediation. So it's an additional step to your point that maybe Huntress has had for a while, but using those signals and integrating them with conditional access to automate it, that's been around for a while.
Oh, okay. Do you have an idea what's the cost for the P2 license then?
P2, if you get it on its own, I believe it's, don't quote me on this, but I believe it's $9 per user per license. You can get a discount if you pay annually. But I had mentioned last time that Business Premium now has two Business Premium add-ons, a security add-on, a compliance add-on, and that bundles multiple Premium 2 licenses into one package that can save you, I believe, up to 50% or more. So if you're looking at something like a Premium 2, but then also you want Microsoft's email protection at Premium 2 level, and a couple other Premium 2 licenses, you might want to consider one of those bundled packages. And it's not the E5 security add-on that's been around forever. There's a new add-on specifically that bolts onto Business Premium, which is going to be fine for tenants under 300 users. So that is a new thoughtful package released by Microsoft. It's again, it can designed to save folks under 300 users quite a bit of money. Like I said, upwards of 50% or more.
Okay.
All right. There are some questions in the chat. Kyle, let me just go. Norm was asking, I thought phishing was a primary attack method. I'm not sure. That was a while ago, so I'm not sure what that was in reference to.
Um, I think I had mentioned that attackers are trying to compromise credentials to get into an environment rather than trying to break encryption, and that's primarily done through phishing. Kind of what Norm is suggesting. And those controls that I brought on the screen from CIS, those are not turned on by default. And the reason why, Microsoft does have some level of security by default, but they don't want to restrict the usability of the product. So they kind of allow more broad and open collaboration than restricting things for you by default. They want people to kind of spin up a tenant and immediately, start getting to work collaborating right away. So it's really on you to look at these different security controls that exist out there and try to determine, based off of your risk tolerance, your business need, your licensing, what's reasonable and appropriate or required in some cases if you're regulated to implement. Because again, Microsoft doesn't try to overly restrict things by default. So that's why, again, you'd want to consider something like a CIS Foundations benchmark to improve your overall maturity and security posture.
Is there a tool that you could install that would show side by side what CIS recommends and what your setting is, and maybe show, you missed what they've recommended? Is there a tool for that?
There's various tools that exist that do something like that. The downside of all tools is the CIS benchmark is made up of manual controls that you typically got to go through the UI on your own to look through. And then such as like break glass accounts. Like everyone can name their break glass account something unique. Like I've seen Captain Kirk and you name it, all sorts of fun stuff. But the qualities are what matter. So, you have to, you can have a tool that looks at the automated portion of what the benchmark's offering, but you're ultimately leaving out 30 or 40% of the controls if you just rely on a tool. So you could have a tool that says, hey, you're 100% compliant with the controls you looked at, but really you've only looked at a subset of the whole. So at best, you're like 60% compliant, which can give you a false sense of security. So, yes, there are tools that can kind of do a kind of a health check in your environment, but there are limitations, and you're also relying upon their analysis, if any, where they kind of rate controls and how important they are. Like, for example, if you have 10 controls that are critical in severity, which one is the most critical? What's most important? If everything's on fire, what's really truly the highest priority? If everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So, your mileage may vary on some of those tools, but yes, they do have a value add, especially if you want to track kind of drift in real time or do a more of a real time assessment. You can save yourself a lot of time with those.
Lonnie has a question about conditional access. If not all users have Business Premier P1 license, seems that conditional access cannot be applied. Am I correct?
So your environment could have at minimum one Premium One Entra license, and that would unlock conditional access, but that's not in alignment with Microsoft's licensing. So you would want to, for every user that benefits from it, you would want that many licenses purchased. So if you have 100 licenses in your environment and 100 users, you're in alignment with Microsoft's licensing. Doesn't mean all 100 of those licenses have to be issued to your users. You just have to at least be paying for them. But again, at least one will unlock the feature. That's not to say in all cases Microsoft allows that loophole. I know of one, for example, I brought up during last week's call, where you could configure Microsoft's email protection through Defender for Office 365 to basically have all users in your tenant in scope to the policies for standard or strict protection. So you get, anti-phishing, safe attachment, safe links, all that standard stuff. But if the user in scope of that policy does not have a Defender for Office 365 license, they're not actually going to get the protections. They're not going to have safe attachments and safe links and anti-phishing controls applied on their mailbox. Microsoft knows that even though they're in scope, they're not actually licensed. So sometimes they're reasonable about it, sometimes they're not. But the best practice is to be in compliance with Microsoft's licensing. No one wants a Microsoft audit there. Not a good time.
Lonnie brings up a point. I'd love to maybe have some others share their thoughts too, as far as Microsoft getting out of hand with their licensing requirements and costs for SMBs. I think just, as you're adding more on, obviously, those costs do go up. I mean, we would hope that the value we're getting out of that is in alignment. However, I think the challenge is we have a lot of other tools, a lot of third-party vendors that we're using that might be overlap with what is provided with some of the security controls in 365. But I think Microsoft doesn't go far enough with a lot of those tools, and that's why we're using these other third-party vendors. So, we might be adding something on that covers something that maybe we're not getting with a third-party vendor, but it's adding a whole bunch of additional things that we might not be using, which does make that out of hand. Other thoughts on that?
My
Yeah.
my thought is like if you're uh, selling these products to or letting people subscribe to them, you ought to make it easy for them to secure them because why would you offer something that can't be secured or that, costs you more to secure? That's yeah, it's kind of frustrating. But on the other hand, if they're like, okay, it takes a huge time and effort to do this stuff, and then you got companies like Huntress, well, it creates a market opportunity for them because Huntress, it's a lot less than $9 a month to put that
And
on a user's account. And like I've got Blumira too for some clients because that does more logging that Huntress doesn't do. But Blumira still isn't at the point where they can automatically lock out an account. Um, but Huntress is. So for me, it's a really good value.
yeah, and then in addition to that, I mean, we're talking about the support that's behind the scenes from those vendors, as well as some of the hands-on stuff that they're doing that Microsoft, isn't providing. Like having people behind the scenes that are actually, assisting in the process.
If everyone can see my screen, this is what I was referring to earlier. So Microsoft's Defender Suite for Business Premium and add-on to Business Premium bundles 5 different Premium 2 add-ons, which is $28 per user per month of value into a $10 package, which I guess saves you 65%, up to 65%. So that's what I was saying. Like you could play the game where you want to, oh, I want this add-on, I want this add-on, but once you add at least like 2 add-ons more or less, you might as well just get this package and get an additional 3 ones, whether you ultimately want to use them or not, because that might change in the future. So if you don't have endpoint protection, you don't have email protection, you need to protect on premises, you want to have a CASB, you want to have conditional access with the risk, based conditional access. You can get all of that for $10. And for the record, I don't work for Microsoft, so this is just a way. This is a relatively new release, so not a lot of people are aware of it. But if you are running into a customer that has like an E5 license or a lot of Microsoft licensing that they're already paying for, typically you'd want to leverage what you are paying for. Like you can, instead of using Microsoft's Office 365 email protection, you could go with a Mimecast or Barracuda, but potentially customers paying twice for email protection. And just from an incident response perspective, if when I've responded to a customer breach, when I have to log into like 6 different platforms to try to understand what's happening and correlate sign in and audit logs, and is there MFA, is there not MFA, it can really slow down a response to a breach. And it's, on one hand, yeah, there's products that exist that might do better than Microsoft, but Microsoft products have really come a long way in the way they integrate into Sentinel now, where you have that SIM-SOAR, and it's kind of like the automation involved. It's pretty powerful. So if you haven't visited any of these features in a long time, I would encourage you to check out some of the latest guidance from Microsoft and what its new capabilities are, because there's a good chance that a customer is paying for something that they're not using that might ultimately even offer better protection through Microsoft than maybe some add-on that they've got. So just some food for thought there. And I did put this link in the chat, by the way.
Eric, I noticed you came off a chat. I wasn't sure if you wanted to jump in, or you came off. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I did, but Mike pretty much stole my thunder. So thanks, Davis. Thanks.
Sorry, Eric. I got another question for you, and this goes back to last week. For token theft, I've seen it happen before, but one thing I never really dug into, but it got me thinking about when you were mentioning it this week. When that token theft happens and somebody is able to get into the Outlook web access piece of it, do you have out of the box, if someone then tries to go and launch the SharePoint app, does that use the same token, or how does that work? Because like I've got well, my own MSP included. We have stuff, we use SharePoint document libraries. So if somebody did the token thing on us um through like Evil Jinx or something like that, they've got that token. Can they also get into SharePoint, or is it limited to just Outlook?
So with when you're stealing a token, you essentially you're resuming that session on your own box. So just by default, whatever the user has access to, because you are that user, you are using their session, you would also have access to it. Some tokens, there can be protections in place where it kind of limits the refresh of that token, it allowing you further access. That some of those capabilities are in preview right now. But generally speaking, when you steal a session, you are that user for all intents and purposes. So you do have access to whatever it is that they have access to.
Okay. But like I've noticed whenever you go from um you first log in, like if you go to office.com login, then you click on admin, then it makes you re-auth and do your token again there. So in that case, the token theft is going to limit them to just that first step, and they'd get stopped in the
That's really kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of access tokens versus refresh tokens. So if the token supports, bringing on additional authentication, then yeah, you would be able to use that one initial token to potentially get into other environments.
For your day-to-day work, are you mostly consulting? Like, are you a Microsoft partner where you only want to promote the Microsoft products, or are you consulting and looking at each client and deciding which tools make the most sense for them?
So, yes, I'm a consultant. I'm also more security agnostic, so I'm not like it's Microsoft or go home. I try to have like a more thoughtful approach where if you're paying for it, you might as well consider leveraging it. But I've had customers where again they have Mimecast or Barracuda for email protection instead of Microsoft, so it doesn't really matter. I think from that perspective, but where it does impact what I do specifically, being more of a security consultant, is the CIS M365 benchmark is written to based off of Microsoft's environment and the implementation of the controls with their products. So it's going to have controls for looking at email protection. So their controls are actually designed for Microsoft's email solution. There's not like additional controls for Barracuda or Mimecast. You have to apply that same logic, what it's actually looking to protect to different products. So when I'm doing a kind of an assessment or remediation, it is more scoped to what Microsoft's offerings are. But yeah, otherwise, at the end of the day, as long as these security controls are implemented, I don't care if you have MFA through Entra, I don't care if you have MFA through Duo. As long as you have MFA, really, that's what's important.
Lonnie has another question. Let's see. So with Microsoft Defender, is there a portal to manage it's all centrally, or is it done individually?
So Defender is a lot of products. It's Defender for Office 365 for email protection, endpoint identity, cloud act, the cloud app security, all that stuff. So for the security side of things, you would want to go to security.microsoft.com. That's kind of the integrated portal for a lot of the security offerings. If you want to launch an investigation and get into auditing, for the compliance side of things, that's when you'd want to get into the compliance center. But for like the Defender security products, that's where the security center you'd want to rely on that, if that answers your question.
And Lonnie, I'm assuming you mean when you talk about individually, are you talking tenant by tenant, or are you talking even at a larger scale of like multi-tenant?
Well, yeah, okay. I mean, like I said, just kind of comparing it to other products. Like, okay, for example, I use Sophos at the moment.
Yeah,
But and so I go into a partner portal, I see all of my tenants, my customers. Then I
yep,
can, I can manage some at the partner level, at the global level. I can manage
right.
some things at individually at the individual customer level. So that's really, and I'm familiar with security.microsoft.com, but I've never really gone into it with the focus on Defender because I'm not using it at any of this point. And my point
Yeah,
was, and my statement was, now we start creating this hybrid approach that I'm using Defender for some things, using some other third party for other things, and blah blah blah.
right.
So yeah, there is an endpoint section in the security center for Defender, which again, I know you said you haven't leveraged that in your case because of your Sophos, but that's where you would find it. And kind of like I mentioned earlier, in case of an incident, just to have to correlate all these logs across different products, it could be a potential hang up. So Sophos is a great product. CrowdStrike, great product. Defender for endpoint, also a really good product. Just keep in mind how that could impact you if there was a breach, and how you would try to give some sort of reasonable assurance that of what happened, and during that breach.
But I guess in this case, it is going to be more just looking at it globally as a tenant. Um, it's not going to be multi-tenant, so you're not going to see all of your clients unless maybe is that where Lighthouse? I don't know if you have experience with Lighthouse. Is that where Lighthouse would come into play, where you would get that multi-tenant, so you'll be able to have all of your clients be able to take a look at a dashboard for all your clients.
Well, and I guess, yes, I could understand it's by tenant because, it's just like if you're dealing with Azure, right?
Right.
I have people in Azure, clients in Azure. So
Yep.
you switch to different tenants to do different things.
Yep.
But like in the case of Defender, and let's just say you're on one tenant, is there like some global policies that you push out to, and then all users or groups would inherit those policies, that kind of thing, at that tenant level?
So like kind of like Dan was saying, you do have tools like Lighthouse, you do have third-party tools that can kind of get into that more granular rollout of policy in 365. Um, so I mean those are capabilities that do exist. Um, you know, but whether like that's not necessarily that you're gonna get as like right out of the box and like just a default tenant, but
Right.
you have to have some other layer above that through a couple different products to try to get something at that level. just just a word of caution when it comes to um, automatic remediation. Let's say you do a scan across all of your managed tenants and you see that maybe all customers don't have a certain control in place. Even if you have the ability to automatically remediate that for everyone, each tenant, as you know, there's a different risk tolerance, there's a different business need, there's different licensing potentially. So you want to review how reasonable and appropriate that control is on a case by case basis. Even if your tool does give you the ability to globally implement a security control, you could, in some cases, cause an outage or more of a problem than even an attacker might, just depending on what the control is. That's just a quick aside.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I get it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Other questions out there? We still have about 13 more minutes, and love to hear what other questions that you guys have. Great opportunity to be able to leverage Kyle's time here. Kyle, how
So,
about oh, go ahead. Is that Mike?
yeah,
Yeah,
you
go ahead, Mike.
mentioned the one case you started to talk about it where they got into the tenant, then they installed an enterprise app that then let them email out from there. Um, I've seen something similar where their enterprise app would let them create accounts. So even after account passwords and stuff had been reset, their enterprise app would let them, create a new one and get back in. Um, what other nefarious stuff have you seen when did you say you did incident response for a while?
Yeah. Yep. I'm, mostly I try to be on the proactive side of security. So doing those assessments, finding out what's wrong, kind of like your annual physical, and then tightening up
Hmm.
the security through remediation. But in cases where customers can't be proactive, typically a lot of the work I've done has come post breach, unfortunately. So yeah, I've had to do the containment, eradication, recovery to some degree. Typically they would hand the bulk of it off to whoever their cyber insurance covers. But like for an initial kind of EMT type triage, I was responsible for a lot of that. And yeah, so like that one anecdote that came through a breach, I kind of talked about this last time. I had a customer where they did the hardening, of implementing the CIS 365 controls, at least as many as they could. And then they still got breached because somebody clicked on a link and they had business email compromised. But new in this version of the CIS benchmark is a control which my company advocated for, which is to limit your exchange email. So by implementing a threshold on each individual mailbox, which you can target through users groups as well. But ultimately, for your average user, if they're not sending more than like 50 emails a day, having a threshold in place that says if they eclipse that, their mailbox gets shut down can really limit the impact of a business email compromise. So something like that email blasting app happening, or even just more of a manual sending of mail, that's where that control would make a big difference. That did save my customer who did the hardening, because they implemented that control. It shut down that mailbox and uh, prevented that phishing email from going to their customers and their gal and whoever else that they were trying to send to. And so that was a huge one. And again, I encourage everyone who hasn't yet implemented that control to consider doing it. It offers a lot of peace of mind, and it can be thoughtfully rolled out in an audit mode, and again targeting certain groups.
Excellent. Other questions?
Any other attacks you've seen where the business email compromise that I don't think people realize how far and wide and devastating it can be to have your email compromised. What's like one of the worst that you've seen?
Um, I mean, when you can't explain the extent of the breach, it's not a good situation. Fortunately, a lot of lawyers kind of like that almost, because they can say, well, absent of evidence that says this happened, we have to assume it didn't happen. So, that's frustrating from my perspective, because, like if someone breaches an account and they have access to your environment, they could do screen recordings and all sorts of stuff. Even if you don't have a log that supports that they export the data into a PST, they could just have manually reviewed all that stuff. So, I've seen cases like, where, logging wasn't appropriate, and then that just became a potential issue with notification and getting, as far as lawyers are concerned. I've uh, responded as part of a ransomware incident where basically the entire infrastructure had to be rebuilt from scratch. They just assumed breach, in alignment with zero trust principles, and that had implications in the 365 tenant, the Entra ID tenant as well. Even though I
So
believe in my
they burn their physical network to the ground, but then for 365, they, well, man, that'd be like impossible because how do you get a new tenant with your same domain name and stuff? So that's probably where you were going through their environment in 365 looking for stuff.
Yeah, we basically blocked all access, and then had to, verify with HR, who should have an account, what's a real active person. And it was all very labor intensive, trying to make sure that folks who, should have access were the only ones who did. So that was going on. I was working on that as the rest of the infrastructure is being
And
rebuilt.
then you had boots on the ground rebuilding the physical infrastructure.
Yeah, re-rolling out laptops, with Office 365, the apps and everything. It was it was a big situation. It was pretty costly too. It was, you know, over $1 million to remediate all that. So yeah,
How many users are we talking?
it was for a dealership. So it was actually had like a bunch of dealerships as well. So I believe it was a couple hundred users. So it was pretty
Okay.
substantial. Yeah, it was a big undertaking, very disruptive.
Brian was asking if we could get a copy of your slides. He had missed a couple of the points. Is
Sure.
that, yeah. If you,
I
if
can send it to you, Dan, if that's easier.
Yeah, yep. If you
Okay.
send it to me and then anybody that wants it, just go ahead and chat and just say right now that you would like that. And then just we already have your contact information, so you just say, send slides and I'll get them to you. Also gonna include um, Kyle's LinkedIn contact information there. Um, so Kyle, one question that comes up is when you run into an issue with like an incident, let's say it's some type of business email compromise, of course the client always wants to know what happened, why it happened. They want to know every possible detail. Some clients want more than others. And what are some of your recommendations on, educating them about the incident, the situation, without giving them too much information? And when I say that, I don't mean hide information, but obviously we all know that, giving them too much information can be dangerous. So what are some of the ways and recommendations that you have as far as having that conversation?
Yeah, in terms of my approach, I mean, the burning question for everyone is what happened. Like they want to know factually what the timeline is, what they accessed, what they did. The lawyers need that information. They need that for breach notification. We need to separate fact from just concerns about what was potentially possible. Again, the most responsible approach is assume breach. But again, a lot of lawyers take the approach of absent like a smoking gun that something specifically happened. They kind of err on saying like, well, we don't have evidence that this actually happened. So even though it's very likely to have happened, we can't say that it has. So that's why, when you see breaches in the news and they say, well, we can't confirm that this actually took place, you should probably assume it's worse than whatever's being reported, just because just how the lawyer's approach is. It's very it's a lot different than what maybe how a technical person would kind of approach what's possible, and having things to support that investigation, like logging is huge. Having like a Microsoft Sentinel or any kind of SIM, kind of like correlating all of your logs from all of your products, is huge. You can like with Microsoft's product, if it detects ransomware, it can on a system, it can remove that system off the network before it can propagate to other systems, and all that's notified to you and the security center. So there's different degrees of automation that you can leverage as well. But in terms of a response, once we know what happened, really businesses just want to, they want to really, the process is containment, eradication, and recovery. We want to stop the bleeding. We want to get the bad actor out, and we want to immediately get back to getting business running. So that could look like doing security hardening after post breach to try to close the doors and windows as the attackers crawled in through. I always like to say the benefit of an assessment is by default, with that CIS benchmark, any environment is at best 20% compliant. So you kind of got the front door left open. So if you as a company or your customers have not paid for a hardening engagement or a security assessment engagement, chances are that front door is open and you don't really want to deal with that post breach. So I always encourage being proactive, and that's kind of what I do is I prioritize those controls, put them on a roadmap, what's critical, what's very high, and all that good stuff to try to thoughtfully and quickly reduce risk in an environment, in a way that is, again, respectful of, risk tolerance, business need, and licensing.
I noticed you throw around the word breach like
Mhm.
freely. And I was advised by a lawyer not to ever use the word breach. Let them use it because it has legal implications and just refer to everything as an incident.
Mhm.
Is that is that your experience too, or do you say
Yeah,
breach because a lawyer did come in and say, "Yep, that was a breach"?
I've heard similar reasoning as you. I mean, I'm using it more freely in this context, but in case of an active incident, yeah, the language you use, especially if it's customer facing, that's all that lawyer stuff that they figure out is how what terms you use, what you're to say, if you get a script on how to respond, all that matters in that context. But like and more of an open forum like this, yes, to your point, I'm being a
Yeah.
little bit more looser with it.
Do
Plead the
you
fifth.
Ooh,
do
go ahead.
you have any special words or approach when the client is somewhat resistant to the security improvements?
I mean, like I said, a very simple way to look at it is Microsoft wants you to hit the ground running and collaborate with that front door left open, essentially. So if they want the peace of mind of knowing their environment is staying dialed in to the latest security controls and measures, that's where you'd want to align to a standard and try to do that at least twice a year. So, if they've been told, that, hey, we're aligned to best practices or whatever, whatever that means is very subjective. You want something of substance to give them that level of confidence that yeah, due diligence was taken, because a lot of customers I've noticed have for example, they might have PHI and PII and be subject to the HIPAA security rule and whatnot if they're a hospital or something. But they might say, well, because of that, we are automatically secure. Well, that's not the case. I mean, the HIPAA security rule is kind of a low bar. It's basic common sense things like, hey, you need encryption in transit, encryption at rest, you need MFA, everyone needs to not use shared accounts. These are all pretty common sense low bar things. But something like a CIS benchmark is going over and above what something like HIPAA would require or a regulation might require. So yeah, whether it's because you're required to through regulation or not, you do want to align to a standard because a lot of those regulations they're really not too difficult to accomplish.
You,
You're
you
not getting
can
it.
you could go to your client and say, "Hey, imagine an email went out from CEO saying today only if you pay your outstanding invoices via ACH, we'll give you 20% off." And and then
Right.
like
Sure.
what would that do to your business?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like to tell just stories from my instant response days, and that kind of
Right.
drives some points on. It really depends on where they're at. What really kind of drives it home for them.
And use real stories that obviously you anonymize them, but use real stories that are equivalent to the size of the business that they are, right? Because I think too often a lot of vendors provide us with examples, and they're too big, or the downtime cost calculators are just so outrageous that they don't really apply to a small and mid-sized company. So know your audience. With that being said, I want to. We are at the top of the hour, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. A couple quick things. Next week, we are going to be covering Microsoft Purview, and we have Seth Irby that'll be joining us back. And also, for anybody new on the call that's not familiar, this call does happen every Wednesday, and each week we have a different business function expert. On Fridays, we have our MSP discussion group. That's at 12 noon Eastern time. So anybody that wants to join, that's an informal peer group where we talk about successes, challenges, and so on. If you go to everythinmsp.com under resources, go to Build It Better MSP discussion group, and you can register there for free. With that being said, Kyle, thank you so much. I greatly
My pleasure.
appreciate it. Everybody that requested the slide deck, I do have I have everybody's information there, and I will make sure to get that out. So have a great day, everybody. Take care.
Thanks. So
Thanks,
long,
Dan. Thanks,
boys.
everybody.
Yeah.